In this next video, now that we practiced how to complete the square, we're going to solve using the completing the square method. Now, when you solve, we're going to focus on problems right now that just start with x squared. So there won't be an a in front of the x squared that's bigger than 1. When you start solving them, you're going to write them in this form, x squared plus bx equals c. In other words, you want the constant or the number that's not attached to an x to go on the other side. Then you're going to take your b divided by 2, square it, and add that to both sides of the equation. So it'll look something like this. From there, we're going to rewrite that left side as a square of a binomial, kind of like what we did earlier. And then from there, since you have a binomial squared, to get rid of the squared, you can square root it, and that'll help you to solve. Here on the right, I have an example what this looks like. So you see on that first step, they got rid of the plus 8. So they did minus 8 to both sides. And then from there, what they did is they took that 6 divided by 2. So we took our 6, our b, and they said, okay, 6 divided by 2 is 3. And they squared that, adding it to both sides. Because what you do to one side of an equation, you have to do to the other. Then they rewrote it as a square of a binomial. Here they just simplified. And then, again, we're just simplifying. Once you do that, you can take the square root. Now, remember, when you do the square root, you'll have two possible answers. You'll have a positive and a negative. And then and the square gets rid of square root. That's why we're doing that. From there, you're actually going to have two equations. So here, one would equal positive 1, and one would equal negative 1. And then you can solve those to get your two different solutions to your quadratic equation. If you remember, we had learned before in the graphing method, the factoring, these can have up to 2 answers. So let's start practicing solving by completing the square. So again, step 1, you want to get the constant to the other side. So here my constant is the negative 11. So I'm going to add 11 to both sides. Here it cancels. And I'm left with x squared plus 10x equals positive 11. Our next step is to look at our b. So here my b is 10. And I'm going to take my b and divide it by 2. That gives me 5. And I'm going to add that to both sides and square it. So I have x squared plus 10x plus 5 squared equals 11 plus 5 squared. Because remember, whatever you do to one side, you have to do it to the other. From there, I can already write that left side as a perfect square binomial. So I have x and a positive 5 squared. On the right side, I have 11 plus 5 squared is 25. If you simplify 11 plus 25, you get 36. So now that I've completed the square and simplified everything, I can start solving. If you remember, when you have a square, to undo it, you take the square root. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Remember, when you do that, though, you're going to have a positive or negative answer. So your answer will be positive or negative. And the square root of 36 is 6. On this side, the square and the square root cancel, so I'm just left with x plus 5. Now I can separate this into two separate equations. And the reason I do that is because of this positive or negative symbol. So one equation is going to be x plus 5 equals positive 6. The other will be x plus 5 equals negative 6. And then I can solve both of those for x. So my two solutions here are 1 and negative 11. And then I'm just going to write these as a solution set to make it nice and neat. I like to do my lower answer first, but either one's fine. So I'm going to put negative 11 and then positive 1. Those are the two possible solutions for x in the original equation. So let's start this again. Again, your first step is to get rid of the constant. Here my constant is minus 10, so I'm going to add 10 to both sides. So I have x squared minus 18x equals negative 72. Now that I've done that, I'm going to look at my b. Here my b is a negative 18. I'm going to take that b and divide it by 2. That gives me a negative 9. So remember, we're completing the square. So I'm going to add that negative 9 squared to both sides. Now I'm ready to write it as a perfect square, or as the square of a binomial. So this becomes x minus 9 squared. And on the other side, negative 9 squared simplifies to 81. Negative 72 plus 81 simplifies to 9. So I have x minus 9 squared equals 9. Now that my square is by itself, I can square root. Remember, when you square root, though, you're going to have a positive or negative answer. So the square root of 9 would be positive or negative 3. Here I'm left with x minus 9. And at this point, you can separate it into two different equations. One of them is going to be positive and one of them is going to be negative. So I have x minus 9 equals positive 3. X minus 9 equals negative 3. And then I can solve for x. So my two solutions here are 12 and 6. I like to write it in a set from lowest to highest. So I would write 6 and 12. But 12 and 6 is also fine or correct. Let's go ahead and try one more of these. On this next one, though, we're going to get different types of solutions. Now that we've learned about the complex numbers, we should know what happens when we have negative roots. So I'm going to start the same. I'm going to get rid of my constant. So I'm going to get rid of the plus 2 by doing minus 2 to both sides. So I get x squared plus 2x equals negative 2. Then I'm going to look at my b, which is 2. I'm going to divide it by 2, and that gives me a 1. So I'm going to add 1 squared to both sides. Remember, we're completing the square. I'm ready to write the left side as the square of a binomial, so it would be x plus 1 squared. And on the right, 1 squared is 1. So that simplifies negative 2 plus 1 to negative 1. Now I'm ready. I have it simplified to get rid of squared. I'm going to take the square root. Remember, when you square root, you can have two possible answers, one positive and one negative. But here, if you remember, we have the square root of a negative. When you have the square root of a negative, you're going to have an I in your answer because your answer is not real. It's imaginary. So instead of being square root of 1 is 1, square root of negative 1 would be 1i. So here I have a positive or negative 1i. Now I can separate this into two different equations. One is going to equal positive 1i, one will equal negative 1i. And then I'm ready to start solving, so I'll subtract 1 from both sides. Here it's a little different though, because these are not like terms, so you cannot combine them. So we're just going to leave our real part first, so the negative 1, and the imaginary part, a positive 1i, will go at the end. Same thing over here. My real part is negative 1. My imaginary part is minus 1i. So my solutions are negative 1 plus 1i and negative 1 minus 1i. And remember, those 1s can be imaginary. So I have negative 1 plus I and negative 1 minus I in my solution set. I'm going to do one more example just for the sake of repeating the steps. So in this next example, we're going to take our constant, negative 30, and add it to both sides. So I have x squared minus 6x equals 27. From there, I'm going to look at my b, which is negative 6. I'm going to divide it by 2. That gives me a negative 3. So I'm going to complete the square now by adding negative 3 squared to both sides. I can rewrite this now as the square of a binomial. So I have x minus 3 squared. On my right side, negative 3 squared simplifies to 9. And if I add 27 plus 9, I get 36. So now that everything's simplified, nice and neat, I have my square. I can square root it to get rid of the square. So I'm going to square root both sides. Remember, when you do that, you get a positive or negative answer. The square root of 36 is 6. So I have x minus 3 equals positive or negative 6. And now I can separate this into two different equations. One is going to equal positive 6. The other one will equal a negative 6. And then I can start solving. So my first solution's a 9. My second solution's a negative 3. In my solution set, I like to go from lowest to highest, but it's up to you. I will just make sure to include the negative 3 and the 9. So again, this method's called completing the square. Get your constant to the other side. Take your b divided by 2. You're completing the square, so you're going to add b over 2 squared to both sides. You rewrite it as the square of a binomial. The reason you do that is so you can take the square root. Don't forget when you take the square root that you can have two answers, one positive, one negative. Don't forget that if you're square rooting a negative, your answer is going to be imaginary. It'll have an I at the end. And once you take the square root, you're going to have two different possible equations, one with a positive and one with a negative, that you can solve to get your two possible solutions for x. Seems like a lot of steps, but just like in math, just like in life, you repeat your steps, you repeat them, it gets easier over time.